If you're renting, you definitely heard someone tell you that renting is throwing your money away. You might even think that yourself. However, renting versus buying is a very individual choice, and whether one is better than the other is very specific to where you actually live and the rental and home purchase prices in your area. Renting is definitely not throwing money away. You might not be building equity, but you're paying for a place to live, and that is worth something. It's not like you're burning money, you're paying for housing, which is a good thing. In today's video, I'm going to look at the difference between renting versus buying a house in my area and show you how you can decide whether it is worth buying a home or just continuing to rent in your area. I'll show you a couple resources you can use and how to make that decision so that you're prepared to make a very informed choice instead of just listening to the general renting is throwing money away idea, because sometimes renting is the best option. I'm a huge proponent of ownership and home ownership, especially if you're planning to build wealth and grow your net worth, but sometimes renting is the best financial option. So we're going to look at both and see how you can determine whether it's better to rent or to buy in your specific situation. Let's get started and look at some actual numbers so that we can make better choices for ourselves and our futures. The best way to decide if you should rent or buy is to run your actual numbers. So in this video, I'm going to run numbers for ourselves. We are trying to decide if we should buy a new home at a much higher price point. So I live in Memphis, Tennessee, and the home price we're looking at is roughly $400,000 to $450,000. So I'm putting in $425,000 and playing around with the down payment. So I think we could save up 5% of that, which would be $21,000. Then I'm gonna go ahead and use the numbers already plugged into the NerdWallet calculator that I'm using here. So the mortgage interest rate is 3.75, loan term 30 years, and I'm gonna use rent as $1,400, which is what we pay for our mortgage basically right now, even though it's a smaller starter home. So in this case, if we bought a new home, it says if we stayed for 3 years, renting or staying in our current situation is cheaper than buying. So we would save $953 per month and $34,000 in total to rent. But what we really want to look at is the break-even number. So this is a number where it changes from renting being cheaper to buying being cheaper. And if we were to purchase this more expensive house, it means that we would need to stay for 14 years before buying is cheaper than renting. So if this is a forever home that we will be in for 20 years or more, then buying is going to be cheaper in the very, very long run. But in this situation, not by much. But there are so many variables. Let's look at another. What if our monthly rent was more expensive? So what if our rent was $1,800, which is what we could reasonably pay for a house of our size in our neighborhood now? In that case, it would change and we would have a break even much sooner, because at 14 years, buying would be much cheaper than renting. And in this case, if our rent was $1,800, we would only have to stay in the new home for 6 years before buying would be cheaper. We would be saving $73 per month and $5,000 in total in those 6 years. But what if we found even cheaper rent and then we were paying $100 less than now? So what if we were paying $1,000 or even $1,300? In that case, buying would never be cheaper than renting if we were trying to buy that more expensive home. So this is one of the situations where you might never want to buy a home. If you are in a market where your house price is more expensive than what you can pay for rent, you may be better off long term renting rather than buying. And this is something that you need to know and to run the actual numbers. I always like to do this with people when you are looking at actual rental prices in your area or the area that you want to go. So I like to look for different options. And so when I look through the Memphis and surrounding areas and look at places I might want to live, I noticed that in reality, this is a very low amount for what I'm looking for. The reality is, if I was wanting to rent a home in the area where I would want to purchase, the price would be anywhere from $2,500 to $3,500 or even $4,000. So I need to use those realistic numbers to see if renting versus buying in the new area that we want to live would make sense. So I'm going to go ahead and change those numbers in my calculator and see how that changes my formula. If I use the rent amount of $2,000, so buying would be cheaper than renting, after 5 years, I would end up saving $9,000. And if I stayed in my home only 2 years, however, if I wasn't really sure about the area and I changed homes again, renting would be cheaper for 2 years. Then if I stayed for 10 years, of course, buying would be cheaper. And the longer I stay in that new home, the cheaper that it would be, because the rent will go up over time. But when you buy the home, the actual mortgage and everything will stay the same monthly. So you have a kind of fixed cost, whereas rent will continue to increase over time. Of course, property taxes will as well. That is why they are factoring all that in with these different calculators. And it's just a good idea to run different numbers on multiple calculators and kind of play around with when you would break even with renting versus buying. It really, really depends on your area, the rent price, and the potential home price of your new home. In my case, when I raised the rent to $3,000, the more buying looks appealing, because the longer I stay in that home that I purchase, the more buying is a winner. Buying would be much cheaper than renting if my rent is $3,000 right now. And in the scenario where I'm paying $3,000 in rent versus buying a $425,000 home, when I look at the 30 years, when I have the 30-year mortgage paid off, buying is much, much cheaper, because then I will have spent $1,384,000 on renting, whereas buying would only cost me in total with interest and everything $609,000. So the savings there would be $774,000, which is a lot of money over the long term. This is why it's so important to both understand how much the numbers change your scenario and what your long-term plan is. Of course, none of us can predict what we will be like in 30 years, but it's very, very important to make sure that you're thinking long-term when you're thinking about purchasing a house, looking at the break-even and the total amount if you are going to stay there forever. I also highly recommend you do this with at least 2 rent versus buy calculators. The first one I used was NerdWallet. This one is from Smart Asset, and it goes through the same thing. For this one, it asks what your monthly rent is for the first question, and I'm going to use that $2,000, and then I'm going to use the same price for the home, maybe a little bit cheaper if we were going to get a fixer-upper. So let's go with $400,000. And then it asks you more questions like your annual income, if you're married. It's kind of pulling in more information. So if you do a couple different calculators, you're going to get some different functions and different numbers spit out. So I highly recommend you look up at least 2, maybe 3 different rent versus buy calculators. With this calculator, when I run some numbers for the monthly rent versus target home price, I get that if we stay for 4 years, buying is better than renting. So if this is a 4-year or more purchase for a home, then we're going to come out better when we buy. If you want to know what assumptions they're making and kind of get some of the behind the scenes on what this calculator is deciding for you, they have all of this right below where they show you the different numbers. And I like this one because it also gives you a sliding scale. So if you want to see when buying is better versus when renting is better, you can just slide it down, slide the scale, and then it will show you the numbers. So if you were to stay for 10 years, and you're going to get the numbers of buying is much better. Then you can also go on the side and change things like your income. If you think you're going to get a raise and you're going to get more money in the next year, or if you see money coming towards you in the future, you can go ahead and go on the side and kind of play with those things as well, and then adjust everything and kind of figure out whether renting is better than buying and when it makes sense for you long term. Where I live with most of these calculators, it is saying that if my rent is a normal monthly cost, then of course buying the new house is better long term. And in this case, you can also use these calculators to see how a different size down payment will affect these numbers. So putting a 20% down payment is great, but if you can only save up 10%, it will show you how long it will take for buying to be a better option than renting. These are some of the calculations that you're going to want to do if you're saving up a down payment to purchase a home, so that you can kind of run through the calculations of whether it is better to keep renting for longer or it is better to stop renting and just go ahead with the down payment that you have. So how much you are saving up to put down on a home can affect the timeline for when you are going to make more money with buying versus renting. This can be a very emotional choice whether to buy or rent, especially when home prices are high and bidding wars are happening. So I highly recommend that you go in with a level head and that you run all of these calculations. You've played out different scenarios where you are earning more money or losing more money, where you're putting more money down, where your rent is different prices. Play around with all sorts of scenarios for what could happen with life and see if it still makes sense in your situation to buy a home. You don't want to go into something and then be completely blindsided by a change in life. So make sure that you are just doing these calculations, playing around with it, and seeing what the numbers actually say. It will put you in a much more powerful and comfortable position to actually buy a home if you have run all the numbers and you know what they mean for your situation. So in this example, it's pretty clear. You can see the pros and cons and the benefits to renting versus actually buying a home. And in your situation, it might be a little less clear cut. So you have to decide on how you want to live and kind of the lifestyle factors and personal choices versus the actual financials of the situation. And that is, for a lot of people, the reason why they buy homes. It's not necessarily financial, because your personal home isn't usually a great investment. It can be, but it's not always. And a lot of it has to do with what you personally want your life to look like. But hopefully this has given you a little bit of an idea on how to determine whether you should be renting or buying, if that's what you want to do. And next, you should check out this video. I think it would also be very helpful if you're trying to consider whether you should rent or buy. It is always good to have more information, and this video will definitely give you that. So check it out, and I will see you in the next video.